Ms. Viha, Ms. Huiyi, and Mr. Aditya, representing the Nanyang Technological University. Your panel for today is chaired by Mr. Yuki Oka from Japan, Mr. Lucas Lee from Singapore, Mr. Jun Bo from China, Mr. Bobby from Indonesia, Manav Garg from India, Kanna from Singapore, Mr. Jake Bustos from Philippines, and Mr. Jesus himself from also Philippines. And last but certainly not the least, Mr. Sandeep Chulani from Hong Kong. I now hand over the floor to Mr. Yuki Oka, your chair for the evening.
So the theme for this grand final of this year's Uadc 2014, you speak of signs and wonders. I need something other. I would believe if I was able, but I'm waiting on the crumbs from your table. Motions. This House believes that corporations are obeying to the development of third world countries. This House believes that instead of countries directly giving aid, all developmental aid should be decided by an independent institution which will not disclose the identity of the donor. And thirdly, this House believes that aid budget allocation should prioritize the development of mobile technology capacity and infrastructure. The teams have chosen the second motion to be debated, and that is your motion for this year's grand final. Now to open the debate, I'd like to call upon the Prime Minister.
I have to speak with this. Ladies and gentlemen, for far too long has aid been rejected and aid facing all sorts of rejection and all sorts of difficulties in terms of being able to reach to the people. That's why we feel that it's best for the acceptance of aid and for aid to be able to efficiently reach the people that we deface those individuals who give the aid to those who need them. In my speech, I'll firstly tell you why should aid be anonymous. Secondly, why will countries still have an incentive to give aid to this particular institution? But before that, a very important clarification in terms of model. First off, what do we mean by an independent institution? It is an independent body that will be made of a diverse pool of countries. The governance of this institution will change every several years, meaning that there will be a rotational process as to who leads this particular institution. There will always be representation. Secondly, the individuals who are made leaders shouldn't be like, mere politicians. No, we think the ones that should be included are like economists, academicians. How will we appoint the individuals who end up becoming leaders of this institution? We will appoint them by a majority vote of the members, meaning that there won't be any room for tokenistic puppets that will come into power making wrong decisions for dictatorial countries. Moreover, when you join, you will have to pay your donations to a particular pool of donation before you get to send it out to those who receive it. Secondly, you are to pay proportionally to what is in accordance with your GDP. Moreover, how's the decision making done? It is based on the necessity of where should aid be given. That means everybody will make a compromise and vote as to where they think is best given these aids to, where do they really crucially need it. Moreover, they will also take into consideration what are the abilities of the receiving government to ensure that they make good use of the aid that we give them. They will vote it. And moreover, and lastly, we also think that it's perfectly fine for these independent institutions to provide conditions to the receiving government before giving this particular aid to them. First question. Yes.
How exactly do you plan to force countries to relate proportionally to their GDP under your policy?
Look, we're not going to force these countries. you have to join these institutions. But I'll tell you secondly, in my second substantive, why countries will have an incentive nevertheless to join this institution even though they aren't forced to. But moreover, why countries will be ensured to pay in accordance with their GDP. Well, the same way how when they join like the World Bank or IMF, the moment you agree to join into a particular membership, that these are the conditions you have to adhere to. We think that consent is there. We don't think that there will be a particular problem. Number one, why should aid be anonymous? As we see in status quo, acceptance of aid, when you place an identity to that aid, allows countries to vilify that aid and reject it. The same thing how we see in Somalia, where the Al-Shabaab refused to accept aid from the West because they saw it as a form of Western imposition. They used that rhetoric, and the rhetoric being particularly powerful, and it taps into the hearts and minds of individuals on the ground to also not want to further accept that aid. They were swayed by the anti-West sentiments, and all the Al-Shabaab needed to do was to point to Iraq and go, if you want the same thing happening to Iraq and Afghanistan to happen to us because of the decisions that the West made, all you have to do is say yes to the aid. We don't think that's something they want. We don't think that's something society wants, so we should reject that aid. That's the sort of rhetoric that the leaders use, allowing for individuals to just be swayed away by this and reject it. So first is the top-down approach of that rejection. But secondly is the bottom-up approach in rejection. Because sometimes even when leaders themselves want to accept it, they are held captive by their societies that say, no, we shouldn't accept that aid because it's also Western imposition. The same way we saw in Pakistan when Nawaz Sharif was forced to reduce the acceptance of aid from the United States of America because people did not want it. People saw it as a form of Western imposition. It was a tactic of the West. They were being smart. It's nothing more than blood money. That was what people told the leader, and that's why the leader was forced to reduce it. What does this mean? This means that the efficacy of aid is like hugely reduced because either people don't get it, because people don't want it, because of the rhetoric that they are forced to face with, or even if they do get it, it's usually like a small portion of it because they have to go through many bureaucratic process. Our side of the house provides an efficacy for the giving of aid because we deface who that aid belongs to, meaning that the rogue leaders now will no longer have the ability and room to use that rhetoric, meaning that there will no longer be a barrier for the West or even Muslim countries to be able to give aid to whoever they want, especially since now it will no longer be seen as a Western imposition of institution, considering that now it's a rotational process and anonymity is coupled with it, right? But secondly, it's not just about the rejection of the acceptance of aid, but it's moreover about countries giving aid to like other countries without placing any conditions. What do I mean by this? I'm talking about China, right? Like the fact that China gives aid with no conditions whatsoever to like other nations, like in African nations, where they say, look, like we're not like the United States of America. We give you aid, and we are the ones who like don't care about your human rights record because we are the ones who really care about you. When in fact what they're doing is just a political strategy to gain power over the global community. Like that's what the sort of room China gets when you don't place an anonymity in the picture of aid. So what the harms of this, right? That means that China has every incentive to ensure the recipient will be dependent on them. China doesn't care about the human rights record, or at least the government, and they want to monopolize the global community. That means aid will be misused. They are continuously used by political elites, by the receiving government. It's sometimes even used to oppress the very movement that we want to liberate. And the fact that now we're the ones changing that particular dynamics because it's given by a neutral institution where aid can be given attached with conditions that is meant for nothing more than humanitarian reasons, not for political agendas. Secondly, why will countries still have an incentive to give this institution? This directly answers Aditya's question. First off, we would like to think that the motion assumes so, otherwise there would be no debate. But secondly, if you don't join, the same way as how countries who don't join and don't want to participate in terms of developing the country or the global community overall will be seen as a rogue state, and we will like to think that no country would like to be seen as a rogue state. But moreover and more importantly is that what do we see in status quo? Is that now countries feel an objective that aid, we want to provide for the objective of countries to make aid ideologically neutral. In status quo, countries have ideological warfare going on. China is afraid of US being a powerhouse, and US is afraid of China being a powerhouse. So what are the reactions? They end up giving out aid to different countries with political conditions attached to it. China gives aid saying that, oh, we don't have any conditions attached to it, we're cool like that. United States of America wants to combat the ideology and say that, oh, if you want the huge chunk of money that we have, these are the list of conditions that you have to meet. In our model, this is at least now neutralized because you can't, when you deface aid, countries will start giving it out of benevolence because you don't allow that sort of ideological warfare to go on anymore. They will still have an incentive to give, right? Because number one, there's no room for competing ideologies. Number two, they will want other countries to develop as well because that means economic benefit
benefits for you. You get to trade with them. You have every business interest protected. Moreover, it's for humanitarian reasons. We would like to think there are still some benevolent countries out there. But more importantly, even if the country is more political than it is humanitarian, populist ideas are always humanitarian, meaning that in countries that usually give out aid, like the United States of America, people on the ground will compel the government to continuously join this because people still have hearts. And I would like to think that this debate should side with the ones who have that heart to ensure we don't disrupt any forms of efficacy in terms of getting aid to reach the people. Thank you.
Thank the Prime Minister for his speech. And to begin the case for the side of the opposition, may we have the leader of the opposition. This or their POIs.
Okay, so what do I do?
Use that one.
Does this go here? All right. Can you hear me? Yeah. Can you hear me now? Now? Okay, now? Okay. Can I get some? Wait. This one? Oh, this one? Okay. Never used them before. Okay. Okay. Mr. Speaker, we think your ability to give aid directly to a country acts as a counterbalance to the very things that they talk about. Under our policy or under status quo, you allow the US to combat the things that China does because of the ability to unilaterally give aid and actually impose those conditions. I'm going to show you a few things. I'm going to show you why the incentives for donating reduced drastically under their paradigm. Secondly, how it's actually harder to impose conditions on countries when China and US are donating to the same pool and the internal tussle that's going to happen. Thirdly, I'm going to talk to you about how we allow our policy or status quo allows you to hold countries that do not donate under their paradigm and hold them to account for not doing their bit to the global community. And fourthly, why countries like to be more invested when they're paying directly and when they can take credit for the change that they can see in these countries. My rebuttals will be integrated, but a few points will stand out. Firstly, they said acceptance of aid is extremely hard because these are seen as Western institutions. Firstly, even under your policies, they're still going to be seen as Western institutions because the largest donors to these bodies will still be the Western nations who are the richest. For the same reason, like African dictators may still reject the IMF or World Bank, even though they are representative, it's the same reason they will continue to do so under both sides. But it's extremely illogical to say that people on the ground won't clamor for change because their needs for infrastructure, education, and food is somehow less important than this anti-Western sentiment that everyone in Africa has against the Western world. We don't think that's particularly true, and we think aid is going to be accepted as it is in status quo by so many countries around the world. We don't think that's a particular problem. But we think there are already checks and balances against the views of aid. You have the Paris Declaration of 2005, in which 92 countries signed up saying that we will sign and say that aid should be effective and the conditions that we impose on aid should not be abusive. So we think there is already an existing international mechanism to ensure that these policies are not abusive towards countries. But countries already have an incentive to donate to countries which need it the most, right? Like you could argue that under status quo, countries only donate to countries where there's a political capital to be found. We think under status quo, countries have an incentive to donate to countries that need it the most. Why? Because the countries that need the money the most is where each marginal dollar of your aid will be most effective in getting you the political power to begin with. So that's why, given the fact that there are competing political interests, the fact that China, India give aid, and other Western nations compete for political influence, it's likely that all countries are going to go and donate aid to countries which need it the most because that's why your political influence can be increased by every marginal dollar that you give. But secondly, there are different countries which give aid to different political ideologies. It's not just one body giving aid to the whole world. You have countries like China and India who have drastically different political ideologies to countries like the US. So we think under status quo, there's a self-correcting mechanism where countries donate to countries which have similar political ideologies and things are balanced. We don't think that's a problem. Why the first argument, why the incentives of aid reduce drastically? Many countries donate to meet certain foreign policy objectives, often to help allies or to be seen as credible sources who stand up for things like humanitarian aid or development in the Western world. You've already seen countries like Australia, for example, and the Abbott government who've reduced their aid budgets to almost zero. There's already a movement in Europe and the UK to reduce aid budgets to countries because of economic recession and because those resources need to go somewhere else. What do? They massively incentivize countries to donate to this large pool because they no longer have the ability to affect political change and meet their foreign policy objectives through this money. The amount of money that comes in to this large multinational body is going to be reduced drastically because countries can never actually focus them towards political change. It becomes harder for you to convince people on the ground in your own country to actually put money into these countries when they see no political end to this, Mr. Speaker. We think aid and development and the millions of people who need this aid the most are going to be deprived because countries that don't have an incentive to give money to a body that they cannot control. We think that's problematic. But secondly, means of political change, and this is the argument from directly clashing with that. We think aid is often an important political tool to affect change in countries which need it the most. The fact that Asian economic restructuring in ~91 was actually fueled by things like tied economic aid. The fact that Pakistan, for example, the only reason they implement actions against terrorism is because US attaches aid to these conditions and says, we will not give you aid if you don't do this. We think often leaders in these nations, especially rogue states, have an incentive to accept this aid. Why? Because often people on the ground clamor for change, and getting aid to develop things in their countries is an important tool to allow these nations, leaders of these nations, to hold their power and continue to hold power in these nations. Under status quo, we can use this incentive for leaders to try and hold on to power by implementing policies which have tied conditions. In fact, like human rights when you give aid to African nations. Things like security when we give aid to nations like Afghanistan and Pakistan. We allow status quo to implement the state change by tying conditions to this aid. Why is it harder to impose conditions under their policy? Because they think they seem to think that it's easy to impose these conditions. It's not, because when China and US are donating to the same pool, there's a greater likelihood of political conflict within these institutions to decide where that aid goes to, right? It's very unlikely that China and US are going to be like, well, we're all donating to the same pool, why don't we just agree on certain things? What does status quo allow? Even if Chinese corporations or Chinese government gives aid to countries without conditions, at least status quo allows the US to counterbalance that by giving aid tied with conditions, by increasing the amount of aid. Their policy doesn't allow for this counterbalance to happen when there's a political deadlock within these institutions and countries don't get this aid and these conditions aren't implemented because China works against countries like the US to not have this implemented. Before I go on, yes. Okay, we think there's a greater likelihood of them doing so when they see direct tangible consequences, right? Debates aren't about absolutes, they're about who's better, who's less shittier than you, and that's why we think the US has a likely incentive to put more money into this when they see direct consequences of this aid. Third argument, it allows us to hold countries that don't donate to account. Status quo with open donations allows us to point to countries who are developed, who have massive GDPs and yet aren't doing their bit. Under your policy, you don't know who's donating. There's no ability for you to target countries and direct international condemnation to rich countries who do not donate. There's no ability for you to direct condemnation towards countries who owe money to poor people but yet aren't doing their part. Under your policy, massively rich countries get away with not donating because no one actually knows whether they're donating or not. We think it's extremely problematic when countries are going to now not donate anymore because there is no international criticism of that money coming in. But fourthly, countries are likely to be more invested if they're paying directly. Like this is also the premise of my first argument, right? The fact that countries want to see and gain credit for the kind of development that happens in countries which they fuel. They want to be seen as the moral, like, guiding lights of the world, and that's why they have an incentive to donate. Under our policy of status quo, countries are likely to be more invested in making sure that this aid is being used efficiently. The fact that this aid can directly be tied to the countries which give them incentivizes these countries, for example, US aid, to make sure that this money is going where it should go. It's more likely that countries like the US are going to do much more than the bare minimum under status quo, and they can take credit for the changes that they want to implement, right? Under your policy, countries will just donate the bare minimum because they have no control over where this money is going. Status quo allows countries to gain a higher moral ground by actually making sure they do more than minimum, right? They're giving them things like technology to implement this aid, making sure that this aid is implemented efficiently, or making sure this aid goes to people where it matters the most. We think that policy obfuscates all those incentives, countries are going to donate much lesser and also care about the actual consequences or are not going to be incentivized to do a lot more. Because they severely restrict the donations to aid, and because they make it extremely harder for millions of poor people across the world to get access to this aid with conditions which help improve political and structural reforms within their countries, we're extremely proud to oppose.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Testing.
Unfortunately, as opposition conceded, the provision of aid under status quo is inherently dominated with entrenched, divisive, ideological interests. Unfortunately, interests like business interests and humanitarian interests are placed secondary because countries like China and the States are competing with one another, ladies and gentlemen, based on that interest. We think it is high time for us to upstart or to integrate, ladies and gentlemen, humanitarian and business interests to be prioritized over other ideological interests. And that's what our policy does. First thing, we're going to look at rebuttals, and then we're going to look at two substantives. One, how our policy solves the culture of dependency which recipient nations are facing. And second, we're going to look at how our policy will grant more aid to its non-international power brokers and why that's a good thing. Before that, rebuttal. One, will our policy still be seen as Western interests dominating this policy? They say that while Western forces are now the biggest donors. Three responses. One, we say that's untrue because in a system where GDP is proportionate, that means a lot of Middle Eastern nations will also become the primary donors over here. That means even a lot of progressive Asian nations, ladies and gentlemen, like China, Singapore, and to some extent even Malaysia, would primarily reduce the interest of Western powers, the point in which you have a lot of nations which have high GDP per capita will also be able to do this. But that argument misses the comparative. The comparative is, under status quo, it is specific Western aid, where individuals can automatically place a faith that that aid comes from the United States, in contrast towards hundreds of other countries which also play into that aid as well. Sit down. But secondly, even if there's a marginal increase, we will say at best it is a marginal increase of Western aid, ladies and gentlemen, at least the forces like Al-Shabaab can't use the rhetoric or can't trace the single root fact of the money, that the money only originates from United States of America. Because now the countervailing narrative is that the money also originates from your brothers, Muslims, from a lot of Middle Eastern nations, and also your Asian brothers out there. We think that's a strong, potent narrative. But my final response here, ladies and gentlemen, we already told you in our model that who will decide where the aid will go to. It will not be Western forces. Under our policy, will be based on a rotational system of governance where all countries will be regionally represented under status quo, in comparison to their policy where only politicians in that country will be the deciders of that outcome. Obviously, it opens up more room to abuse and selfish, exploitative reasons. That means, ladies and gentlemen, there's a big harm which we're able to cut down on our policy. That means Al-Shabaab will no longer be able to reject or reduce the efficacy of aid on our model. We think that's a big harm which they need to deal with. Sit down. Secondly, will there still be incentives for countries to engage in our policy? They gave us three rebuttals. Number one, they say, countries will only donate when there's incentive or when there's a political incentive tied to it, because at times they want to bring political change. That's when the argument which Ameera gave you was particularly important in this debate. We told you under status quo, aid is primed on selfish, exploitative reasons, where countries like China and the States are very cautious in handing out aid because they think China's giving out aid for its own exploitative reasons, while the United States is giving out aid for its own exploitative reasons. Once we deface aid, ladies and gentlemen, that's when countries like China and the States prioritize business and humanitarian interests, because now it's no longer dominated by one power broker, which is either China, Russia, or the United States of America. We think in that regard, ladies and gentlemen, political influence, which we want to talk about, is a bad reason why people donate under status quo. Sit down. The second reason which they give us is that countries want to take credit in developmental projects. 3 responses. Number one, you can still take credit in the collective effort of building a national project. That's why under status quo, billions of dollars are still being donated to the Asian Development Bank, IMF, World Bank, and Bretton Woods foundations. This clearly shows that there are already political incentives for people to do so, because at times they do care about humanitarian interests. When tens of thousands of people are suffering out of poverty, ladies and gentlemen, your population will demand for you to still donate under status quo. Sit down. But even if humanitarian reasons are insufficient, there are good business reasons why you want to do so. In just the same way how the rhetoric, ladies and gentlemen, which was perpetrated by IMF, where in order for us to help ourselves, we need to help you first. Because if all countries are rich, it becomes easy for us to bring our business interests in that country. There are natural reasons why this will happen. Sit down. The next thing which is, so we think that's sufficient, right? Third rebuttal. They say conditional aid, we need to apply conditional aid in order for us to liberate regressive countries. I have 2 responses there. Number one, under our policy, the condition will be fairly set and will be independent of selfish, exploitative reasons, because it will be economists, ladies and gentlemen, who will set this up. And as we have mentioned, this won't be tokenistic economists, because in order for Saudi Arabia to appoint its economists, it must first gain a majority vote within the rotational board of governance. We think that means these economists prioritize need-based in contrast to selfish, exploitative reasons. But unfortunately, under status quo, these conditions are being exploited if you only look at single donor country. Like if you look, ladies and gentlemen, where China can exploit the African continent, ladies and gentlemen, when it does not place any kind of conditions. Your policy and all the harms which you talk about already exists under status quo. Under policy, we reduce that harm to the point where it comes from a collective body of governance, in contrast when it only comes from one country. We think that's obviously better. Yes.
The reason the IMF is different is because the voting power is directly proportional to the money that you give the IMF. This is not the same as this.
As I've mentioned before, there's still business interests, humanitarian interests tied to it. But more importantly, in ADB, people don't see China as the biggest reason why the Philippines has developed. People attribute success to all Asian nations, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's sufficient. First argumentation, the culture of dependency. Under status quo, ladies and gentlemen, United States controls Chile in terms of the recipient of aid, and China controls a lot of African nations because it is the main supplier of aid. I know they want to say, oh, but if China wants to control this country, they can have a last-minute change. This country can move to different nations. That can't happen. One, because a sudden retraction of aid means that you will hamstrung developmental projects which have already been funded. But secondly, at times you simply can't find an alternative because United States might not be willing to fund the African nations, ladies and gentlemen. What's the harm here? That means that country will automatically become the puppet of the supply of aid. Example is the example of Kashmir, ladies and gentlemen. When China was fighting for its end of Kashmir, it pressured its members in the ADB to not give money to its Indian developmental projects because India was also fighting for Kashmir as well. But second harm, it also pushes for military expansionism, like military bases in Africa, which French pursued for, ladies and gentlemen, even though people in the world did not want it. But the condition was, you must allow military expansionism to happen. If not, we will disallow the provision of aid under status quo. We changed that. Ladies and gentlemen, let's be clear. They themselves considered that aid will only be given when there are political reasons tied to it. That means small nations, it's a rebuttal, small nations like Mozambique, small nations like Mali, ladies and gentlemen, will be left out when there are no political reasons tied to it. Only power brokers, or when there's an interest to invest, that's when it will happen. We give investment to all countries premised on need. I'm very happy to propose.
Right, Prime Minister, I'd like to ask for the leader of this.
Oh, I clip it to my back. Yeah, give me a minute. I can't make this happen. Can you hear me?
I don't think
Am I amplified? I can clip it to my collar.
Yes.
Oh, cap this.
Yes.
Oh my god. Oh my god. Wow. Now? I'm still not. Hi. It's chair, so it's like that only. Okay, thanks.
Your lecture.
So I just put to my mouth, yeah? To best get the maximal amount of aid and to target it towards the maximal protection of the poor and suffering, we must respect that states are essentially self-interested and that can't be changed. And therefore, they will and should only donate if they can build alliances and influence other societies in doing so. I will go a bit further in my case later and show you how this act of influence is actually much greater than the exploitation they mischaracterize it as. But before that, two rebuttals. Firstly, on the incentive to donate. They came and told us, right, that you must pay money in accordance to your GDP, like the World Bank. It is really different from the World Bank, right, where you get a say in international economic policies that affect you. And furthermore, the amount of money you give to the World Bank determines how many votes you have and how much you have in it. That is why there is a natural incentive right there, unlike their policy. Furthermore, under the World Bank, any amount you're given is open and disclosed. That is why you will get any individual credit your country gets for donating to begin with. But more importantly, because you pay money according to the amount of GDP you have, right, that is going to really take off your rich countries, the ones with the most money out there, and give them even less incentive to do so. Furthermore, what we see, right, is that they came out and told us, no, the Western states won't donate the most. That doesn't negate the point that Western or not, your richest countries will never be happy to take on a burden of aid. But more importantly, there's a lie, right? US and EU are the ones with the highest GDP and the greatest economy in the world. Therefore, we don't really think it's fair for you to say that the Western people will therefore not be the ones being forced to give the highest amount of money. But what did they tell us with regards to incentive? They told us three things. First and foremost, they said you will donate because otherwise you'll be characterized as a rogue state. No. What makes you a rogue state? Things like threatening to nuke people. Things like North Korea sending missiles over to hit South Korean islands. So we don't think that a refusal to use your own money to donate to other people, when you have no obligation to do so, will make you be painted in this light. Furthermore, they said you would donate because you want to be seen as benevolent, where you have no competing ideology. Honestly, why would a state want to do so? If a state can't further its own ideology or protect its own national interest in doing so, we don't think that the state would want to donate to begin with. Honestly, it's the state's own money, right? And the state has limited money to effect many different national priorities. And the state has to account to its people every election as to whether it has used the money in the best way possible for its own country. We therefore don't think that benevolence would be a compelling reason or any reason at all for any developed state to begin with. They told us that there will be popular support pushing for benevolence. Very idealistic, but not true. Even if there's popular support for aid, right, no country, no thank you ma'am, is going to support their own government giving away lots of money, more than other countries have to, without control of where that money goes, whether that money goes to allies or enemies to begin with. So we don't need any incentive. The incentive Saddiq came out with, that is credit in a collective image. Not really, because we realize, right, that even if you still have some sort of image retaining, you can't really choose where your money goes to. And the image of being forced to give money to your enemies and your allies is not an image that you really want to begin with. But the one Mitra brought forth to you, given this idea of collective donations, I can still get my image by shirking my responsibility, by not giving as much as I have to. So we don't think the image point is a compelling incentive either. So we realize there's no incentive on their side whatsoever. That brings me on to the second rebuttal. On the efficacy of the aid that is therefore given out. There are two reasons why they think that the aid will be more efficacious on their side. First and foremost, because organization Al-Shabaab that doesn't like the West, wouldn't take Western aid, will now be perfectly happy to take the aid. Organizations Al-Shabaab, right, are extreme. They are militant. That is why they are so extremely anti-West. I don't think that you should make the US or any other nation fund these people. Fund people whose policies and rhetoric go against everything you stand for. Fund people whose money will be used to attack your very nation. Furthermore, right, the rhetoric from Al-Shabaab in a moment is not based on proving the money trail. There is a reason why these organizations don't even want to work with international institutions like IMF and World Bank, because they are so extremist in their rhetoric, nothing would convince them otherwise. Before I move on to preventing misuse, I will take your point.
There are some dictatorial nations who would have perverse incentives to fund Al-Shabaab. But why our collective accountable board of governance has an incentive to fund Al-Shabaab?
Okay, first he concedes, right, that Al-Shabaab, the Ameera is the example, is something that they wouldn't want to fund to begin with. But more importantly, I will show you later, in my case, when you have direct aids from different nations that counterbalances exploitation from more dictatorial nations. But that will come in a bit. Moving on to my last tier of rebuttal, on preventing misuse, right? We realize that there are many existing mechanisms that are in place without compromising donor countries' choice. Think of the Development Assistance Committee, where you have 23 countries say, okay, let's pull our aid together and decide where it goes. But there's full consent from all these countries and also full disclosure how much each country gives. We also realize, right, that the way to truly prevent misuse of funds on the ground is to say, enforce the fact that on the ground officials are not allowed to be corrupt. And you can't really do that, especially if your institution is led by technocrats and not powerful world or national leaders. More importantly, we realize that usually it works out best on our side, right? When a developed nation like the US, they say, okay, you sort things out in your nation, and then I'll be willing to give more aid to you. That is truly how things work out. That's why ideology is so important, right? When you push or get to say liberalization on the ground and so on. That brings me nicely on to my case proper. I'm going to deal with two things today. First and foremost, how basically direct aid acts as a very important counterbalance. The thesis of the argument is simple. I'll show you how direct aid counterbalances different state interests and checks the influence of states less interested in, say, human rights and fair development. But under the other side, power is skewed in the hands of certain regimes that can still push funds over through things like corporations. What do I mean? Basically, there is no direct aid, but economic relations remain. So in countries like China, right, you still have state-run companies that work with, say, Zimbabwe, Angola, and earn money from it. There's huge profit for both sides, and at the same time, you ignore rights, you call it dictators, you have profits that don't reach the people. So what is essentially happening is that China will have more incentive to reduce aid and redirect money to these state-run companies. That also means that authoritative states like China and Russia can continue to support and prop up flagrant rights abuses and unsavory dictatorships. On the other hand, Western liberal democracies don't see the point of anything anymore because they can't control how this aid is used as an incentive to influence other states towards better human rights and equality. That is precisely why we need direct aid, so that each state can push their ideology, so values and rights of the people can be emphasized, instead of allowing the state-run companies from oppressive regimes to push for hurtful policies. But secondly, it's really fast, right? In the long term, therefore, it allows countries to push for strategic alliances with developing nations. That is what will truly best benefit the poor, right? Aid as diplomacy basically means there are long-term programs where you can push for steady development and infrastructure in other countries. So if you really weigh the debate, you realize that on our side, we have money that pushes self-interest while benefiting the poor. And it's counterbalanced to make sure it is not harmful. On their side, no money is going to come anyway. So if you truly want to help the poor, we think that our side is the way to go. I'm extremely proud to oppose.
This was supposed to be a clear debate in deciding whether or not it's best for an independent institution to give aid as opposed to individual countries deciding by themselves to do so. They tried to muddle this up by saying it's not possible. There is no political capital to do this. These are by fiat, ladies and gentlemen. This debate assumes that we have international community does this, and therefore the debate then becomes whether or not, given that circumstance, do you think it's better for an independent institution to do so or individual countries to do by themselves, right? But even if they want to resort to that dirty tactic, we will still do it. First, will people join, ladies and gentlemen, and will money flow? First, ladies and gentlemen, they said, oh, people donate because of selfish reasons. We said, firstly, ladies and gentlemen, that's not necessarily true. The United States has continuously donated for, I don't know what you're saying. Yes, is that better? For that, ladies and gentlemen, they have continuously donated for humanitarian reasons as well, but also it makes political sense for them to be humanitarian when people on the ground also vote for those things, right? But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we told you the point at which these countries don't join means that they're often seen as, if not a rogue, ladies and gentlemen, at least they're alienated by the international community. If you don't want to accept the idea of IMF and World Bank, in just the same way, ladies and gentlemen, China joined the World Trade Organization even though it didn't make economic sense for them to do so because it was okay for them to violate human rights standards. We think that means, ladies and gentlemen, because you don't want to be alienated by the international community. Furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, it makes business sense for you to do so because your alienation means you lose out on opportunities that other countries may feel uncomfortable in trading with you as well. We think that necessarily means these countries have an incentive to join. This means six. Second, ladies and gentlemen, they said, oh, but even if they join, no one will donate. This is when Aditya needed to listen to our model, ladies and gentlemen. In just like the United Nations, when you join, you must pay, ladies and gentlemen, according to a proportion of your GDP. That means, at least under our model, there is a continuous form of payment done, as opposed to under yours, where you say in status quo, United States is reducing funding. That means under ours, if they join, ladies and gentlemen, we can ensure continuous funding from them. Sit down. Second, ladies and gentlemen, that means that under your model, that doesn't happen, right? Given that, even if, right, money flows, the question then is, who has more acceptance from these countries, right? Because even if they can say, oh, we have more money under ours, you don't necessarily prove that this money is being well used. Number one, ladies and gentlemen, we told you that these countries often do not accept aid. And no, we didn't say we will support Al-Shabaab, we wanted to support Somalia, right? Second, ladies and gentlemen, we told you that the reason these countries often do not accept aid because they say it's Western imposition, they say, oh, first of all, political leaders can use it, but secondly, individuals on the ground can use it as well. Just like in Pakistan, ladies and gentlemen, where it is unpopular for you to take aid from the United States, meaning the ability for you to take aid and develop your country is massively hampered. We think this will not happen under ours, right? They said, oh, but the same thing can happen with IMF and World Bank. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, that's not necessarily true. People are more open to taking aid from IMF and World Bank than from individual countries, right? But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we also told you, even if we told you the reason that you may argue that is because the IMF, ladies and gentlemen, appointment is often controlled by Europe, for instance, right? In the World Bank, the United States president decides who is the president. Under our model, our institution is going to be full of independent individuals, ladies and gentlemen, who are academicians, etc., who will ensure representations from all kinds of countries. Means you cannot run that rhetoric, and even if you do, counter rhetoric can be run to say, no, that's not true. All countries have representation. All countries have similar levels of voting. This is why, ladies and gentlemen, that won't happen, right? They say, oh, political deadlocks will happen under your model. No, we already told you that's unlikely to happen, given, ladies and gentlemen, we are not allowing politicians to run these institutions, but rather academicians, technocrats, and economists to be able to do so, ladies and gentlemen. We think that means your political deadlocks cannot happen. Go ahead.
Under your policy, you don't even know the Western nations that aren't donating. How do you alienate both these nations to account under policy where it's all?
For the second time, Aditya, if you had listened to our policy states that if you want to take a membership in that particular body, you have to donate in according to proportion of your GDP. I hope that slow enough for you to catch. Third, ladies and gentlemen, how are developing nations being developed under ours? First of all, they said aid restructuring can happen under yours because you can give aid, because you can give conditions. That's not mutually exclusive. It's not like our independent body cannot put conditions in order for you to develop in a sustainable way. But second, ladies and gentlemen, under yours that happens much worse. Why? Because the point at which, ladies and gentlemen, you are dependent on one country essentially means that the point at they're able to
exploit you. They're able to gain votes from you in international bodies. They're also able to make sure that, like, for instance, military expansion by France in some African countries have happened because they're dependent on French aid, ladies and gentlemen. We think those are the kinds of exploitations that you allow under your model. That's not something you dealt with, right? But second, ladies and gentlemen, even if we concede that, you know, we will lose out on some aid because China still wants to independently give aid, even under those circumstances, we have more capability to combat China's ability, ladies and gentlemen, because we have a larger pool of body and a bigger political bloc in order to oppose them. If those countries, ladies and gentlemen, want to be able to moderate themselves, want human rights standards, they can justify to their people by saying, look, I'm taking it from a neutral body as opposed to China. We think that's how you also create agency for these nations to be able to moderate. Sit down. We also told you, ladies and gentlemen, that necessarily means under our model, under their model, they often fund dictators, etc. We are able to counteract those things, ladies and gentlemen, by providing a political bloc which does not do so and is against it, right? Often under their model, human rights standards are not ensured, ladies and gentlemen. Often these conditions are not given because China, etc., continuously doing all of those things. At least under our model, ladies and gentlemen, we ensure that those human rights standards are set by this institution, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that is how we fight all of those kinds of things. We must understand, right? Even if you are to concede that, oh, China will still continue doing that, the combating ability, you said that currently we can combat it by the United States individually funding. We think their ability to combat will be much more when when they create a political bloc with the European Union, for instance, ladies and gentlemen, and are combined, ladies and gentlemen, in their efforts to do so. This also creates more pressure on those African countries to not then take aid from China and then take aid from the bigger political bloc that exists. This means even if we concede their dirty tactic, ladies and gentlemen, that China will not join, even then we have an ability, more ability to be able to combat those actions. Furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we are the only side in this debate that has the ability and creates any form of like possibility for us to end up in a world where we don't fund dictators. We are the only side in this debate who have any possibility who will give conditions based on proper human rights standards, right? We think, ladies and gentlemen, countries will always have an incentive to make sure that money is used because obviously they want to do so, right? They don't want their money to continuously just go away and keep giving it to this institution. This institution also has an actual incentive to ensure their money is being properly used by these nations. Lastly, we already told you smaller nations such as Mozambique, etc., are not funded when individual countries donate for political reasons only. That's a huge harm they still have not responded to yet. That we solve on our model. For all those reasons, we are proud to take this championship.
Prop fiat allows you to define that an institution will be formed. Prop fiat doesn't allow you to declare that all countries will join and all of them will give the same amount of money and that will happen. You can't guarantee that on that side. We're going to do two things in this speech. We're going to look at the problems government set up and why we think they don't meet any of them. And secondly, we're going to look at incentives for joining the institutions. Actually, let's start with incentives. This is what they wanted to say. Saddiq agreed and conceded in his speech that countries are self-interested, that they give aid for their own ideological reasons and only want to give aid to their own allies for particular reasons. Yet at the same time, in the same speech, said that countries had a reason to be benevolent and altruistic and were going to give money just because. We never really heard why. The argument from them was, it's just like the IMF and the World Bank. No, it's not, because the IMF and the World Bank are not anonymous. You know exactly how much you donate to the IMF and the World Bank, and everyone knows where that money is going and how it works. The check on the money exists because it's open, and there's international scrutiny that can exist on how much money you're giving and where it's going. They cannot just say that countries can escape from it. We told you on this side that countries can escape from paying the amount because because no one knows. There is no international media scrutiny and all of that. The argument from them was this: if you want to join, you must give proportional amounts to your GDP. Yet, you can't be known as to who you are, you have absolutely no political influence, you have no credit for donating, you have no benefit whatsoever to yourself, but there's an incentive for you to give to this organization. That makes absolutely no sense. Ameera conceded at the start of this debate that these countries can't be forced to join. Under the paradigm, if they can't be forced to join and they have no incentive to join, then they won't join and no money will end up on that side. We don't think incentives exist. Let's look at government problems and whether they actually solve it. This isn't the idealistic world that this organization actually works. We think that there are 3 problems that they set up in this debate. At the start, when it came to Ameera's speech, she said rejection by organizations like Al-Shabaab was a problem. Saddiq tried to confuse us in a POI by saying, not really, because collective accountable bodies don't want to fund the Al-Shabaab anyway. Which means this debate wasn't about organizations like Al-Shabaab, yet at the same time was. We don't actually understand how that works. We're going to think that it's not exactly how it works. The rhetoric of the Al-Shabaab is not hinged on an accountant defining what identifying money trail of the money is, right? It doesn't happen in such that an international collective organization is suddenly going to be recognized by the Al-Shabaab as not being Western, not having blood money on their hands, and therefore can be accepted. We tell you on this side that the international collective organization will still be rejected because some of the money still comes from blood money, as Ameera put it. In that sense, it's not going to work and they're not solving their own problem on that side. Even worse, we think that it's more likely that Chinese corporations and state-run corporations are still going to fund your organizations like Al-Shabaab with no check and balance because your institution can't do it and these organizations aren't going to be able to do it. The second problem they wanted to tell us, well, these countries or exploitative countries use aid for political ends like military expansionism, and all of the things on culture of dependency. Before we explain it, 6 different reasons why that is bullshit. Go.
The question is, if it's really true the United States wants to combat China's interests, why won't it then join with other countries in order to create a political bloc to combat this very?
Because the US can do it without a political bloc, you can do it on their own. We don't really need a political bloc for that. Let's look at using it for political ends like military expansionism. The first thing they told us is, well, a culture of dependency means that countries are going to be extremely dependent on one particular country to give them aid. We told you that's not true, because there's a market competition for aid too, right? Every dollar that China gives to a particular country, the US or India want to give equally for the very same ideological reasons and characterizations they wanted to give you. That means it's a self-correcting mechanism. If the China pulls out of a particular country because they didn't meet certain standards, the US has an interest to then go in and put in their political influence at that particular point and create that change. So no, we don't think there's a culture of dependency on a particular country. But 2, we told you that there is a check on this without government policy, right? We told you things like the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness or the Accurate Agenda for Action that regulates these things in the international community means that there's an ability to check on abuse and exploitation amongst the international community without side government's policy. But thirdly, we told you that there's a greater pressure on accountability when you know the people who are giving the money, how much they're giving, and why they're giving, so that the international scrutiny will stop individuals or stop countries from exploiting individuals that way. That is why we all know today that when Chinese corporations exploit certain natural resources from Africa, that it's open and out in the public and China gets condemned for it, and we can check on it. On that side, it will not happen. The last thing that we told you is that conditions therefore are important. And this was the strange part from their speech. Because on one hand, they wanted to ensure that human rights standards and all of the other conditions are applied. And we needed to have some sort of liberal democratic stance in terms of conditions. On the other hand, they didn't want conditions and they didn't want tied aid and they didn't want any of this aid to help in any particular way. We told you on this side, the likelihood for effective conditions like human rights standards, like labor standards, was going to be low when 2 ideologically polarized nations give to the exact same tool for the exact same conditions to happen in place. So all of the expectations of having human rights standards and labor standards was absolutely impossible. What was the last problem then that they had? They told us small countries like Mozambique weren't going to get any money because no government was going to give them money. We told you right at the start in Mitra's speech That was completely untrue. That there was an incentive for as many countries as possible to give to countries that need it the most, because there's an ability to get the most amount of political influence per dollar in the countries that need it the most. So there was an incentive for many countries to diversify in who they give aid to. One, because they can get political influence, but two, because there are different blocks in the world that have different political ideologies and different groups of allies. Different groups of countries were going to give to different people, which means your ability to reach out to more numbers of small countries existed when you were able to give to your own political ally and not just anyone in general. We think that the likelihood the incentive for countries to want to give to countries as much as possible only existed when you allow countries to use their self-interest to want to allocate budgets towards developmental aid. When you don't give them the incentive to get a foreign policy end goal out of it. One, as a government, they have no incentive to give. Two, they have no ability to convince their people on the ground to want their government to give. We don't think it works. We're very proud of NTU to win this.
The priority in this debate, right, are the poor people in developing countries who are in very great need and whose future can only be bettered through developmental aid. The debate is therefore won or lost on how best to go about helping them. Under that calculus, I'm going to cover three things. First and foremost, how do donor states actually think? And here we see a central clash between self-interest and benevolence. It's not really a clash because we kind of want it, but let's cover it anyway. So, first and foremost, how does, say, the US Parliament work? Do your senators sit there and look at pictures of starving Ethiopians and feel like stirrings of pity in your heart and say, God, maybe you should donate? No, it doesn't really work like that. What really works is that your parliament discusses based on a rational calculus of how best to assign different portions of your state budget. They think, given our limited budget, who are our allies that we want to help? What sort of policies do we want to push within these ally states? Do we really want to prop up a dystopic Zimbabwe or North Korea, or incite them to change their policies for the better not only of these countries but also themselves? That is precisely where self-interest always takes precedence over any false idealistic calculus of, say, morality and altruism. At the same time, we therefore see how the self-interest is compatible with furthering the interests of developing states to begin with, because often what is better for the stability of the developing states is also better for the donor states. They want a stable region, a stable world, for better political and economic prospects to begin with. But that brings me on to my second point. Given that countries all operate in a self-interested way, why does the disincentive of alienation not work on their side? Essentially, what they're left with to say that states are going to take up membership in this sort of organizations, right? Because they want a good image, because they fear alienation, they fear being seen as a root state, because somehow not donating makes you North Korea. But honestly, why would a state want to join? Especially a rich state that is made to pay more than everybody else out there, every other member also getting the same sort of collective recognition. Furthermore, why would a state want to join if it can't control whether the money goes to states you like and openly want to support, or a state that you want to censor, a state that you want to go against? How do you justify to your people, right, that I'm US and your taxpayers' money all went to Syria? Whoops, not within my control. I don't really think that's how states are incentivized. We don't really think it's a fiat problem, right, but a stupidity problem. Because we realize that there will be less incentive membership, and it's fair for us to argue that. But even if somehow states are so foolish as to join, we also have the idea showing you how you create a deep political deadlock when these organizations, therefore impeding the efficacy of getting aid quickly to countries that really need them the most. More importantly, to sum it up, right, we don't think that not donating to Mozambique, the small states they are so worried about, right, will really alienate US or China, big economies that everyone wants a piece of. But thirdly, right, on this idea of not donating to unsavory parties, because their first concern, right, also extremists like Al-Shabaab. And we're not really sure what to say about that. When you think that the collective money of the world should be directed towards the most extremist factions out there, people who don't really want to work with a great half of countries around the world. But let's take them at their very best, right? At their very best, organizations like IMF and World Bank have failed to get humanitarian aid to Myanmar. But states like Singapore or Malaysia could. Why? Because there is trust and long-term alliances between these different countries. That is precisely why our points on being able to donate to and support your allies, being able to have long-term alliances is so very important. That is a true way to build good donor and recipient relationships and allow for progress throughout the world. So if you really want to better the world, right, we realize you must be undergirded by a narrative of realism. So what are you really left with? At their very best, right, and I don't think this is true, most countries are going to join. They're going to get angry, right, because their interests aren't really being met or respected. So you create a deadlock in these organizations. At the same time, you don't create any change in corruption on the ground in these poor countries, so it's never shown us how you have any power to create that change. At the same time, political will goes down day by day within donor countries to begin with. But really, right, given they haven't dealt with the disincentive point, they haven't dealt with characterization of self-interest, what happens is US and EU are like, screw it, I'm done, I'm not joining you. China and Russia will decide to influence their politics and support them through companies instead of membership. You have no long-term alliances for aid, but a rotating leadership of randoms. For all those reasons, therefore, we think you truly want to help the poor, you respect self-interest. For all those reasons, we're extremely proud to oppose.
Our worst case scenario is that nothing happens, that the status quo which they would like to perpetrate will still happen, while selfish, exploitative interest will be the primary reason why aid is given out. And at least on our policy, we attempted to show that with the existence of this institution, we can water down the influence of exploitative, selfish reasons. You need to keep in mind that our worst case scenario, ladies and gentlemen, is their best case scenario, is that nothing will happen and status quo will remain without them showing why there are additional harms how our policy would perpetuate. I'm going to ask two questions. Who can garner more aid? And secondly, who provides an accountable provision of aid? So firstly, they said that aid will only be given when credit can be claimed. What did we tell you? We told you that countries have natural benevolent incentives to ensure that this happens. It is an unfair characterization for them to say that politicians only argue for selfish, exploitative reasons. We've given you a myriad of instances where countries have still donated, even if they can't claim political leverage over it. But even if humanitarian reasons are insufficient, we give you business reasons. This is something we need to deal with. All countries have an incentive to ensure that countries across the world share the economic pie with them as well. We think there's an incentive we have yet to engage. Their response in rebutting collective interest is they say, well, if you like IMF, if you more you donate, the more votes you have. That's when our primary preemption came into the picture. Why are countries so drunk for votes? Primarily it's because of the inherent power struggle, which is premised on fear, where the United States donate premised on the fear that China will dominate, and conversely it happens. We take that out, ladies and gentlemen. That means the primary reason under policy where countries donate is premised on benevolent humanitarian reasons, in contrast to selfish exploitative reasons, which is premised upon neutralizing fear which exists on the ground. You need to take that out from our case, ladies and gentlemen. We agree that countries are self-interested. However, we water down that self-interest massively, the point in which your aid is independent of ideological interests which status quo perpetrates. We think that is clear. We agree, ladies and gentlemen, that we can't force countries to join. But we gave you two good reasons why countries will still join. Number one, because the failure to join means that you will be seen as an international pariah, a country which does not care about supporting the international and global development, ladies and gentlemen, like how United Nations operates. Even if you join, does not mean that you have more votes unless you are UNSC. But more importantly, the biggest reason, was also the reason which I gave you, is that you would want to join because you want a world where aid is independent of ideological interests. Philippines and Malaysia, the vast majority of countries, would want to support an organization which is no longer dominated by a single donor, which is United States or China. We think that's a massive reason why countries will still join. Because this